I believe I've told the story before of how I went to class when I was teaching in Honduras, and it was the last class of the day on July 2nd. We were supposed to be teaching about the 4th of July. I taught the children, or the young leaders, that were in 7th and 8th grade. And when I went to the final class, which was 7th grade, all of the students were lined up outside the class. Some of the teachers that were from Honduras, two of them were in the classrooms. One of them was sitting in one of the seats that belonged to one of the students and was looking on their cell phone and laughing at the cell phone. As a matter of fact, when I looked in the room, they were showing what they had on the cell phone at that moment to the other teacher. I acted in a manner that is the only appropriate manner in which to act. See, the students were minors. It was not appropriate for me to tell the students to walk out with me. I do not regret that decision. Sometime later, I was trying to apply and had been granted another teaching position, but my passport got stolen. And in the effort to try to acquire a new passport, I had some difficulties. And during that time, somebody was trying to get me to cooperate with them on a technology project. They wanted me to run scenarios connected to a technology project that was in the media at that time. It had been announced in the media that the technology was in development. It was a year and a half away from when they anticipated unveiling it. I said, "What do I know about this technology? I don't have experience with something at that level," but then I started thinking about what they could possibly mean. I ended up in a class myself. I had an instructor. I asked my instructor very sensible questions. If you claim you're in a network as an instructor, and there are the kind of people in that network that you say you have in that network, then it can be very unbecoming for that network to be associated with an instructor engaged in the kinds of activities that this instructor was engaged in. Writing off questions, not maintaining standards, making requirements for each of the students on this online class to identify themselves and give a biography, not following up when certain students lurk rather than participate, finally resulting in a flawed modality around a test, refusing to acknowledge it and the implications inherent in just telling us to keep taking the test over and over again until we pass, and then saying, "We don't have time for these questions." I didn't stick with the class, and I came to understand the request for my assistance in that technology in that manner was in bad faith. Now, later on, things changed. I started another course, another instruction program, where I was learning technical skills that I understood would be necessary to provide inspections of industrial facilities, including potentially gas and oil pipelines, or facilities that made materials necessary for infrastructure construction. I had a variety of reasons for wanting to study these techniques. I wanted to be a pipe inspector. I thought that it was a naturally transferable skill set from my previous experience as a journalist and editor and my previous experience in compliance department of the Department of Public Health. But once I started studying these techniques, I started having realizations on a very significant level of things that may otherwise have seemed beyond the capacity with somebody that had the kind of formal instruction that I did to comprehend. But once I actually engaged with them, this was a different manner. I felt at the time that while my teachers were qualified, my instructors were qualified, and that my classmates were professional, that there was also an element that I had recognized in the instructional program that was akin to when I had studied a martial art. And I remarked on this with two of my colleagues in class one day. And there was these questions about why the teacher was engaging in this manner. Why was the instructor acting in this way? I said, how many times has he told us that he studies karate? How many times has he told us that he has proficiency in a martial art? There's a reason he's doing this. What did we sign up for? That's different than applying to be a grammar teacher in a middle school. There's no room for psychological operations when it comes to training a teacher that's going to be working with youth and minors, especially in primary education and especially in education concerning English or a second language, where they're translating and learning how to think differently and learning about the social comportment of that society based upon the instructor. If you're 40 years old and you've been a newspaper editor and traveled around the world, or if you're 30 years old, 35 years old, and you've spent substantial time with an engineering background, having worked in the petrochem sector, that's one thing. But if your intention is to be an instructor of primary education or even high school level or colegio, it's not appropriate to subject teachers or instructors to psychological operations in order to determine the stressors in their personalities, and also to obligate them to financial requirements in terms of their performance in front of their students. It's not acceptable. Now, when I was studying these technologies, a first kernel regarding the information I got on the technology I'd originally been asked to, or shall we say, exposed to. Mind you, I've studied radiographic film interpretation, so when I say exposure, this has a variety of implications, including the inversion. And in that regard, I realized that with a good faith intention, what I was being asked to participate in could well have been a very, very substantial school security system. See, part of what the technologies I studied and part of my personal experience is that electromagnetic frequency has a very profound impact on the alertness, attentiveness, and disposition of students in the classroom, and can impact not only their socialization with other students, their behavior with the teacher, but also the manner in which they cultivate their own expertise and their own interest. A lot of what is misdiagnosed, for instance, as attention deficit disorder, I think is actually about a hyperexcitation of certain natural development processes young people are going through and should be able to go through without chastisement or embarrassment or some sort of performance requirement. Their financial capabilities are subsidiary and secondary to the other things they have to offer and should not even be on the table until such time as it is understood that they have the capacity, including all the tools they need, to be able to do it safely, effectively, and accountably. And that means you don't obligate them to pay for their education themselves. There's no reason at this point in this world we are in now that any minor should have to try to go to college or purchase a flat or maybe spend a year traveling or even start a small business with having to take out a loan. I honestly believe this. Children are born rich. Every child is born rich and abundant and creative. When did we get to a point where it was okay to use our children for our own finance, for commerce, for loans, for trade? It's not acceptable. We are way too far along as a global responsibility to allow for this to persist. There's no excuse. And even teachers have to understand this. We should have a place of honor for teachers in our society, but we should not allow an undue influence on prioritizing them in manners that would attempt to provide a smokescreen or a cover up for the financial or other exploitation of children in lieu of honoring other obligations that we as adults have. Now, I say this speaking as somebody that now understands I have been financially and electronically sexually exploited since before I entered puberty. But that's no excuse for anybody else to tolerate any other child being subjected to that. My generation is the generation that should have ended that by all means available. Fortunately, there are a number of means available. And if we have the correct priorities, we can avail ourselves of the most meaningful and sustainable options, which under no circumstances includes the financial exploitation of a child. Now, I wrote something and I published it on my blog some time ago. This time I was still on the streets. But I still went through with, at various stages, my own understanding of what would be a school security system, both technologically, but also financially, and hopefully with some acclimation to cultural adjustments that would complement the technological aspects. And when I was a teacher, one of the things that had happened is the Ministry of Education had passed a policy that I had been told about that said that you could not require the students to leave their cell phones at home. That if the parent said the student should have their cell phone with them, that you could not say anything about this. You couldn't ban the phone in the class. I think this is the most disastrous decision that a Ministry of Education can make. And I think it was opportunistic, and time has demonstrated that not only was it not in the best interest of students' safety, but was only able to be implemented based on less than the optimal considerations of what the priorities that would be appropriate should be. So when I composed what would have been a sort of cultural, or rather a sort of policy that would have complemented the particular technological structure of the school, the concept of the actual technology that would be on site in terms of what would be contained networks and or where there may be an appropriate node for intersection of the actual campus, as well as considerations of proximity to radio towers or to places of commerce such as a bank. These also were to be supported with a policy that was to be implemented on a school basis. And that also understood, at least in Texas, the role of the ISDs, as well as my experience from when I was a journalist covering local school councils. The concept of an elected body of the community, where members had to have specific qualifications for their post. And then once they did, they were put through an election, they were elected to that school council, but then that school council had very important responsibilities. Now, since I wrote this originally and published it, I originally wrote and published it on January 16th of 2019. So today would be the 2-year anniversary of the original publication. I was not entirely conscious of the implications of the time frame around which I wrote it, but I had been working on it for a while, and I had actually created a schematic of the particular kind of technological application regarding the actual security in the facility in February of 2018, and I'd been working on concepts connected to that throughout 2017. But when I wrote this, one of the things I did not put in it at the time, but then later came to develop in terms of a policy, was the understanding that a particular person on the school board could potentially apply a policy that I understand a former Secretary of Treasury discussed regarding a mandated savings program. The understanding of a mandated savings program for all young people, that if the government made a investment of a certain percentage of its GDP toward providing individual bonds or some other kind of security for every student in school that was allowed to be interest bearing, by the time that student graduated from high school, they would have enough money, hopefully, to attend a college, to perhaps get involved with a technical school or a trade school where they may be able to involve themselves in business, or maybe do something else upon graduation. And this would be a commitment that the nation made to the future of children, rather than trying to continuously go through processes of appropriating connected to the welfare of children so that then it could be used as collateral for other people's financing. This would also say a lot about municipal financing that uses the data of students as collateral for other financial considerations when it comes to municipal financing, including pension obligation and benefits associated with people that work for the municipality, including teachers. There should be a separate process. There's no reason any teacher should get paid based on financing associated with their students as collateral. And if there's any need for any payment on interest concerning any of the financing that goes into working with young people, including in the administration, then this needs to be done independent of whatever the interest would be that would be accruing on securities associated with providing a mandated savings program for young people. I'm 43 years old. I haven't been allowed to register more than $10,000 total in income in the last 6 years. But I would go another 10 years if I needed to make sure that this program was put into effect effectively. Understand, I understand I've just finished 25 years of what legally constitutes peonage as part of capital outlays through the federal appropriations process that were misrepresented as federal student loans, that were actually somebody else's effort to loan me out based on obligations they took out using me as collateral since before I hit puberty. But the restitution I'm owed, and the restitution people like me are owed, in addition to the prosecution of the culprits, is to assure that no other child ever has to experience not only that, but the 25 years of attendant cover up after it occurs. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it, with the situation we are in at the moment, now is a very appropriate time to consider this and this kind of systematology for its merits. We have to consider unconventional options anyhow, rather than defaulting into lesser evilism or lowest common denominatorism after being socially and politically engineered out of our actual essence. Then let us try to aspire to actual principles that will do something to create a foundation for our children and our future leadership even if we didn't have it as a model for ourselves.